Kick-ass facts! Spontaneous human combustion. Pew, 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 pew! Spontaneous human combustion refers to the death from a fire originating without an apparent source of ignition. Or is there? A belief that the fire starts within the body of the victim. The idea and the term spontaneous human combustion were both first proposed in 1746 by Paul Raleigh, a fellow of the Royal Society, in an article published in the Philosophical Transactions concerning the mysterious death of Countess Cornelia Zaghari Bandi, an Italian noblewoman, generally known for the circumstances surrounding her mysterious death, which is frequently described as a possible case of spontaneous human combustion. Some accounts say the Countess was a brandy drinker. Oh, he looks cool as shit. And that she used to sprinkle camphorated brandy on her body to relieve physical pain. Camphor is a waxy, colorless solid with a strong aroma. Spoiler alert, remember the waxy part later. The maid accompanied her to her room and left the Countess already asleep. The next day, when the Countess didn't get up at her usual time, the maid went to wake her and found only her remains. The room was full of soot. The body of the Countess had been reduced to a pile of ashes that was little more than a meter or 3 feet away from the bed, although her lower legs, below the knee, 3 fingers, and the front of her skull were relatively intact. The bed and the rest of the furniture had not been affected by the fire, but they were covered by a greasy and smelly layer. Let's fast forward a few years, 1885, to the small farming town of Seneca, Illinois. A woman named Matilda Rooney burst into flames. She was alone in her kitchen when it happened. The fire quickly incinerated her entire body except for her feet. The incident also claimed the life of her husband, Patrick, who was found suffocated from the fumes in another room of the house. The tragedy left investigators baffled. There was no reason to suspect foul play. The Rooneys had been relaxing and drinking whiskey that evening. A farmhand who had spent a few hours with them hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary. Furthermore, no source of ignition could be found for the blaze. Although the flames had been intense enough to reduce Matilda Rooney to ashes and a few fragments of bone, they had not spread to the rest of the room. The fire seemed to have started in her body and stayed confined in her body. Charles Dickens used it in the book Bleak House, where the sleazy Mr. Crook ends up as a dark, greasy coating on the walls and ceiling. In the preface of the book edition of Bleak House, Dickens defended his use of spontaneous combustion against accusations of implausibility. He cited several famous cases and judgments of doctors that such a thing was indeed possible. He writes, "I shall not abandon the facts until there shall have been a considerable spontaneous combustion of the testimony on which human occurrences are usually received." Descriptions of spontaneous human combustion date back to the 17th century, with many cases recorded in the 19th century and a handful in the 20th and 21st centuries. Altogether, there are a few hundred recorded possible cases. In the early 19th century, the public pretty much considered spontaneous human combustion a punishment. The victims were often alcoholic and overweight, and more were female than male, so there was a general perception that it was a kind of retribution for a debauched lifestyle. Newspaper accounts of suspected cases didn't help the situation, since they really played that up. It made sense at the time that a body saturated with a flammable substance, alcohol, would become flammable. Should you be concerned? Yes, you should be No, not even a little bit. None of the proposed scientific explanations have held up to scrutiny. Some of the early theories relied on way outdated ideas, such as the notion that ignition could be the result of the imbalance of bodily humors. The Victorian explanation that alcohol rendered the body flammable doesn't work either, seeing that the concentrations of alcohol in even the most foobar person are much too low, and that an ignition source would be required. Also, the moral comeuppance theory is also a load of shit. In the 20th century, forensic scientists noticed the wick effect, for drama, in which clothing worn by the victim can soak up melted fat, acting like the wick in a candle and creating conditions for the body to smolder for an extended period of time. Remember the previous spoiler alert? Waxy substance. Experiments have shown that this effect can produce many of the unusual characteristics associated with spontaneous human combustion, such as the complete or nearly complete incineration of the body and the lack of fire damage to the victim's surroundings. The likely explanation for suspected cases of spontaneous human combustion then is an external ignition source, such as a match, cigarette, or electric spark, that sets off the wick effect, but the evidence is destroyed by the fire. Although alcohol doesn't make the body more flammable, severe inebriation or other forms of impairment may be a factor in some of these deaths, since the victim may be unable to react to a slowly developing fire.